Good day, dear friends. We are busy with Mark chapter 14, verse 53 to chapter 15, verse 15. Mark 14:53 to 15:15, and it is study number 24 in Mark's Gospel. I'm going to put it on the screen so that you can see it, and then I'm going to read. On the left-hand side, Mark 14:53 to 15:15. They took Jesus up to the high priest, and all the chief priests, elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they could not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, "I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days I will build another, not made by man." Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses?" he asked. "You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy." And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you are talking about," he said, and went out into the entrance. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it, and after a while those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you are talking about." Immediately the cock crowed a second time, and then Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the cock crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Very early in the morning, the chief priests, with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached the decision. They bound Jesus, led him away, and turned him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner for whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "What do you want? Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priest had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." And wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them, had Jesus flogged, and handed him over to be crucified. Well, that's the reading, and then we are going to look at the questions here on the right-hand side. And the first question is, how much of the gospel has Mark explained so far? Now, what he means by explaining so far is when you consider what has been said from the beginning of the gospel, right from the beginning, from the start, what had Mark explained so far? Is there anything that has been left out? That's the question. Is anything left out? Well, so far he has explained everything. The only thing that is outstanding is the prophecy that Jesus was going to die and that he was going to rise again. The fact that Jesus was going to die and that he was going to rise again. And if you remember a summary of the gospel like we find in Romans chapter 1, verse 1 to 4, there it says, this is the gospel of God, which he declared beforehand through the prophets, and it's concerning a man who was, as far as his human nature is concerned, he's a descendant of David, and as far as his divinity is concerned, he's declared with power to be the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. And so we have the gospel explained to us, we have it predicted and prophesied to us, but what needs to happen is that Jesus has to go to the cross and to fulfill prophecy, and then he has to rise from the dead to prove that he is indeed who he said he was. Now the second question there is, why does Mark include verses 55 and 56? These verses about the chief priest and the Sanhedrin, looking for evidence, but many testified falsely against him. And also verse 57 to 59, false testimony. You can see there's the words testified falsely, and again here they gave this false testimony against him. False testimony twice. And then again a third time, even then their testimony did not agree. And then of course 60 and 61, where the high priest says, what is this testimony these men are bringing against you? So we have seen in these three sections, 55 to 56, 57 to 59, and 60, 61, the words testimony repeated again and again. They were looking for evidence, verse 55. They could not find any. They testified falsely. Their statements did not agree. So all these words are concerning testimony and evidence. And then in the next section of verses, verse 57 to 59, again, false testimony. We heard him say, yet then their testimony did not agree. So it's already 5 times. Evidence, they could not find any falsely. Their statements, that's 4 times. False testimony, 6. 7, their testimony did not agree. And now, to the irony of the whole thing is the high priest stood up and said, what is this testimony? And Jesus didn't answer. It wasn't necessary to answer because their testimony was worthless. So that is what is going down in these 3 groups of verses that Mark wants us to understand, that there was no charge against Jesus. What is Jesus claiming in verse 62? And why are 63 to 65 ironic? So let's go to 62. Here, I've called this section Jesus' confession. This is what he confesses. This is not what the false witnesses say, the trial, and I've put that in italics because this is no trial. It's an illegal trial. There is no, for a trial to be illegal according to the Mosaic law, there should be 2 witnesses at least that agree. And also, a trial cannot be held after sunset, between sunset and sunrise. So that is illegal on all counts. So what is Jesus's real guilt? And here he confesses what he really is guilty of. Notice the high priest asking him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" The Blessed One, of course, God. And Jesus confesses, "I am," he said. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, of course, this is a quote from Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14, where we have a vision, or Daniel has a vision at night of an heavenly court, and he sees the Ancient of Days in session with thousands upon thousands of angels in attendance. And then there's someone in verse 13, we read, there's someone with the appearance of the Son of Man who comes into the presence of the Mighty One. And he is given authority, power, and sovereign rule over every nation, tribe, and tongue, and every group that is on the earth. And he's given this rule forever and ever. So Jesus is claiming to be the Son of Man in Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14. And so the high priest tore his robes. And what is ironic about the fact that the high priest is tearing his robes? Do we need any more witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. And they obviously, if the fact is, if Jesus claims this, he's equal to God. If he's able to stand in the presence of God, and he claims to be the Son of Man. However, if he is lying, then obviously it's blasphemy. But it isn't blasphemy. So what they are tearing their robes about is actually ironic, because he didn't claim anything falsely. Now, would it have mattered to Mark's presentation of the gospel if he had, and remember his presentation of the gospel in chapter 1, verse 1, this is the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. One called Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. So we have heard that he has been called the Messiah or the Christ in chapter 8 by Peter and the fellow disciples. And the outstanding matter is he the Son of God? And if he left this out, because he has clearly said to his disciples in chapter 8 in the middle of Mark that he is the Christ, he agreed with their confession. He said that he's in agreement with that, and now he claims to be the Son of God, that he is the Son of Man, but he is the Son of Man, one like a human being, coming into the presence of God and sitting at the right hand. And you don't sit in the presence of a great king unless you are his equal. Right, so now we go to question number 3. Of course, the other thing I just wanted to mention here is also, this is also not just the quote of Daniel 7:13, but also Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, capital letters, the first Lord, capital letters, Yahweh said to Adonai, Lord with lowercase. So the Lord Yahweh said to Adonai, sit at my right hand. So he's quoting Psalm 110, verse 1, which is also a quote or a prophecy about the Messiah. Right, so question number 3. Why does Mark tell us about Peter's denial? Why does he interleave it with the Sanhedrin's interrogation? And what aspects of it does he stress, and why? Would it have mattered to Mark's gospel presentation if he had left out this part of Peter story. Okay. Well, the thing we have to remember, Peter is the one that he said he will never deny Jesus. He's the one that said, even if he has to die, he will die with Jesus. And we know that even in the garden, he already deserted Jesus in the sense that he only had to stay awake and pray with Jesus, and he fell asleep 3 times. And now he's here in the presence of the enemies of Jesus, and he is denying Jesus. And he's also, remember also in that passage, the prophecy of Zechariah, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. Now, that prophecy is now coming into fulfillment because the sheep are being scattered. The sheep are actually denying that they know the shepherd. And this shows us Peter's weakness. Right, so we're gonna, obviously it would have mattered if we left this out because it's a fulfillment not only of Zechariah's prophecy, but it's also a fulfillment of the prophecy of Jesus that they will deny him and that Peter will deny him and that Peter will deny him 3 times before the cock crows. And which takes us to the next question. How is the trial before Pilate like and unlike the trial before the Sanhedrin? And why does Mark include verse 2? Right, let's have a look at verse 2. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. Why do you think he includes that? Well, I think there's 2 reasons. Jesus is the Christ. The King of the Jews is the Christ. And he clearly says that he is the Christ. And for the Jews to kill him, the charge has to be something like blasphemy, but they've got no power to kill him. For the Romans to make the charge against him both true and lethal is the fact that he claims to be the king of the Jews. That means he's a rival king. Or Pilate can spin it that way to think of him as a rival king to Caesar in Rome, because Judea is a province of the Roman Empire. Okay, numbers verses 3 to 5. Again, the chief priests accuse him of many things, and again, Jesus is silent. Just like in the trial before the Sanhedrin at night, Jesus makes no reply. There's nothing to reply to. The only question that's worth replying to was this one here in verse 2. Are you the king of the Jews? Yes, I am the king of the Jews. I'm the Christ. And of course, this one before the Sanhedrin. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand. So he makes it clear that he is not just the Messiah, but he is actually divine. Right, so that's verses 3 to 5. Verses 6 to 11, why does Mark include verses 6 to 11? Well, it's a story that at the feast it was customary for Pilate to release a prisoner. And what do they want? They don't want the king of the Jews or their Christ or their Messiah. They would rather have an insurrectionist, a murderer and a criminal like Barabbas. And then they call for the crucifixion of Jesus. Crucify him. Obviously, they can't crucify somebody, so they ask that that Pilate. Well, that's the next question, verses 12 to 14. What shall we do with the King of the Jews? Crucify him. The Jews can't crucify anybody. The only persons that can crucify as somebody in the Roman Empire is the Romans themselves, so that they have to do it. And again, this is a prophecy that's being fulfilled. Jesus in Mark's Gospel on a number of occasions, in Mark 8:13, 9:13, 10, in chapter 10 again, he prophesies that he is going to be handed over to the Gentiles, that he's going to be flogged, that he's going to be humiliated, mocked, that he will be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And the way that the Gentiles, the Romans, will kill him is obviously by crucifixion. And in verse 15, Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So Pilate agreed to their demands. The question here is, what are the ironies of verses 15, 1 to 15? If it mattered to Mark's gospel, if he left out the account of this second trial? No, as I've said before, the prophecy of Jesus on 3 occasions in Mark 8, 9, and 10 is that he will be crucified, or that he will be handed over to the Gentiles, that he will be betrayed, that he will be uh, handed over to the Gentiles, that he will be put to death by the Gentiles, and that he will rise again. So all these things are descriptive of the way that the Romans would go about executing somebody. Right. Question number 5. What big questions are asked in this passage? Why are they important, and why and how do they relate to Mark's gospel as a whole? How does the way they get answered in the passage relate to Mark's gospel? Who has been tried or tested, and what are the verdicts? Well, the big questions in Mark's gospel, if you again go back to chapter 1, verse 1, it says it's the gospel about a man called Jesus, who is the Christ, the Messiah, and the Son of God. And in this passage, he confesses to be the Christ, and he confesses to be the Son of God, and he is seated at the right hand of God, so he is equal in a sense to God. And also, he is the Messiah, he's the King of the Jews. So those big questions have all been answered. Well, it hasn't been proven that he's the Son of God because he hasn't died yet and he hasn't risen from the dead. So question number 6, what is the main thing this passage teaches us about Jesus? How should we respond? And what is the main thing it teaches us about ourselves? How should we respond? Well, if this passage is true, then Jesus is the Christ. He's the King of the Jews. He's the Messiah in Hebrew terms. He's been prophesied about in the Old Testament. He is the Son of God. He is the Son of Man. He is the one who's equal to God. Those two scripture references or prophecies that he refers to, Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14, and Psalm 110, verse 1. And if he is indeed the Christ, and if he is the Son of God, we should respond by faith, and we should repent of our sins and ask for forgiveness, because we know that he came, and he came to give his life, as we said in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, I've not come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. So if I believe that in faith, then I will be saved. I will be part of his people and part of his kingdom. And if he is indeed the king of Daniel 7, the one who has been given all authority over every tribe and tongue and nation and all peoples, for now and for all eternity, and his kingdom is a kingdom that will never be destroyed and never pass away, then the best way I can respond is to swear allegiance to this king and to bow the knee to him and to ask him to hold me by grace, and to forgive me by grace, and to hold me as a trusted follower, as a dear follower, and give me the love that he has. And that is the message of this passage. And obviously you can decide to believe this, or you can reject it. As Pilate and the teachers of the law, the Sanhedrin, the priests, they heard the same testimony and they rejected it. The Jews heard the same testimony and they rejected it. So you have to make up your mind for yourself. Thank you, and that's all for now.